The chains moved like living things, silver blurs in the lantern light, and every man in that dusty street felt his blood turn to winter. One moment they were laughing, all five of them, circled around the thin Chinese man like wolves around a wounded deer. The next moment, the first chain cracked across the leader's wrist, and the pistol went spinning into the dirt, followed by a scream that didn't sound human. The second chain wrapped around another man's ankle and yanked, dropping him hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. The remaining three stumbled backward, hands frozen halfway to their holsters, eyes wide as saucers, watching those steel serpents dance and coil in the night air like they were possessed by something ancient and hungry. She stood on the porch of the general store, her knuckles white against the railing, watching the man she'd trusted for 3 months finally reveal what he'd been hiding all along. His face was calm, almost peaceful, his movements flowing like water over river stones. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man who'd finally stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. The leader of the gang, a thick-necked brute named Cobb who'd been terrorizing the valley for the better part of a year, cradled his broken wrist against his chest and staggered backward. His face had gone the color of old milk. "What the hell are you?" he whispered. The Chinese man didn't answer. He just stood there in the moonlight, those twin chains hanging loose at his sides now, dripping with the promise of more pain, and waited. But let's go back to where it all started. 3 months earlier, the summer heat had turned the valley into a furnace. Sarah Meadows stood at the edge of her dying cornfield and watched the dust devils spin across the cracked earth like the ghosts of better harvests. She was 29 years old, a widow of 2 years, and she'd learned by now that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. The corn was yellow when it should have been green. The well was running shallow. And somewhere in the hills behind her property, Cobb and his men had made camp again, which meant the cattle would start disappearing soon, just like they had last autumn, just like they always did when men with guns decided that a woman alone was an easy target. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with her sleeve and turned back toward the farmhouse. That's when she saw him for the first time, a thin figure in ragged clothes, collapsed in the shade of her barn. Her hand went instinctively to the rifle she kept propped by the back door, but something made her pause. He wasn't moving, not the stillness of someone hiding or waiting to ambush, but the terrible stillness of someone who'd simply run out of strength. She approached slowly, keeping her distance, watching for any sign of threat. What she found instead was a man near death. He was Chinese, maybe 40 years old, though it was hard to tell with his face so gaunt and sun-darkened. His clothes were little more than rags, torn and stained with dirt and what might have been old blood. His feet were bare and blistered. Wrapped around his thin waist, almost hidden beneath his shirt, were 2 lengths of chain, each one ending in a small weighted dart. She didn't know what they were then. She thought maybe they were some kind of rope or tool. His eyes opened when her shadow fell across him. They were dark and deep and utterly without hope, like the eyes of a man who'd already made his peace with dying. "Water," he whispered, just that one word in English barely accented at all. She should have left him there. That's what sense told her. That's what the town would have told her, and Reverend Holloway and old Silas at the general store. Chinese weren't welcome in this valley. Most of them had been driven out years ago when the railroad work dried up and the mines started closing. The ones who remained kept to themselves in a small camp near the river bend, surviving on whatever work the white folks were too proud to do themselves. Nobody trusted them. Nobody wanted them around. But Sarah Meadows had buried a husband and 2 babies in the ground behind this farmhouse, and she knew something about being alone in a world that didn't care whether you lived or died. She looked into those hopeless eyes and saw something that made her decision before her mind had finished weighing the options. She went inside and brought back water. He drank like a man who'd been wandering the desert for days, which, she would later learn, wasn't far from the truth. When he finished, he looked up at her with something that might have been surprise or might have been the beginning of gratitude. "Why?" he asked. Because you needed it, she said simply. She gave him food next, bread and dried meat from her meager stores. She let him sleep in the barn, on a bed of hay in the corner where the afternoon sun couldn't reach. She didn't ask his name or where he'd come from or what had brought him to her dying farm. She figured those were his secrets to keep or share as he chose. It was 3 days before he was strong enough to stand properly, a week before he could walk without leaning on the walls. And during that time, Sarah discovered that she'd taken in more than just a starving drifter. She'd taken in a pair of hands that knew how to work and work hard without being asked. He fixed the broken hinge on the barn door that she'd been meaning to repair for months. He mended the gap in the fence where the foxes had been getting through to the chicken coop. He dug out the silted section of the irrigation ditch that had been choking off water to her vegetable garden. He did it all quietly, without fanfare, appearing at dawn and working until dusk, and every evening he would leave a small pile of whatever he'd accomplished on the step outside the farmhouse, like an offering. She started leaving food for him in return, then clean clothes that had belonged to her husband, then a proper blanket when the nights started getting cooler. They rarely spoke more than a few words to each other, but a kind of understanding grew between them, the wordless partnership of two people who had both been abandoned by the world and found something like purpose in each other's company. His name, she eventually learned, was Chen Wei. He'd been a railroad worker once, years ago, then a miner, then a cook in a mining camp, then a wanderer moving from town to town trying to find any work that would have him. He'd been driven out of his last camp by men who decided that his kind weren't welcome anymore. He'd been walking for weeks, heading nowhere in particular, when his strength finally gave out in her barnyard. He never talked about the chains he wore around his waist. She never asked. The trouble started when she brought him into town. She hadn't meant to cause a scene. She just needed supplies, and Chen Wei needed new boots because the ones she'd given him were 2 sizes too small, and it seemed natural enough to bring him along. She'd forgotten, somehow, what the rest of the world was like, or maybe she'd just stopped caring. They walked into Silas's general store together, the Widow Meadows and the Chinaman, and the silence that fell over the room was thick enough to taste. 3 men stood at the counter, farmers from the north end of the valley, and their faces went through a rapid series of emotions that settled finally on contempt. "Sarah," Silas said carefully, not taking his eyes off Chen Wei, "what's this about?" "He works for me now," she said, her voice steady. "He needs boots." One of the farmers snorted. "Works for you, doing what?" "Fixing what needs fixing, working harder than any hand I've ever hired." "He's a Chinaman," another farmer said, as if she might not have noticed. "You know what they're like, thieves and opium eaters, the lot of them. Can't trust them as far as you can throw them." Chen Wei stood silently beside her, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. He didn't react to the insults. He didn't defend himself. He just waited, like he'd been waiting his whole life, for the moment when the boot would fall and he'd have to move on again. But Sarah was tired of waiting, tired of watching good people suffer because small minds couldn't see past the shape of a man's eyes or the color of his skin. "He's a man who needed help," she said quietly, "and I gave it. That's all there is to it." "You're making a mistake," Silas said, lowering his voice. "People are talking, Sarah. They're saying things about you, about what kind of woman takes in a strange man, especially that kind of man without any. Let them talk." She bought the boots and left, and Chen Wei walked beside her in silence all the way back to the farm. That night, she found a bundle of wildflowers on her doorstep, tied with a piece of twine. She didn't know where he'd found them in the drought-dry valley, but she put them in a cup of water by her window and looked at them for a long time before she went asleep. The hostility grew slowly, like a fever building in the blood of the valley. Farmers stopped nodding to her at Sunday church. The reverend gave a sermon about the dangers of foreign influence and kept glancing at her pew. When she went to town for supplies, conversations would stop as she approached and start again as whispers behind her back. And then Cobb came down from the hills. He showed up at her fence line one afternoon with 2 of his men, all 3 of them armed and smiling the kind of smile that made her stomach turn to ice. Chen Wei was in the field, working the irrigation channels, and she saw him look up and go very still. "Afternoon, Widow Meadows," Cobb called out. He was a big man, running to fat but still dangerous, with small, cruel eyes and a reputation for violence that stretched across 3 territories. "Heard you got yourself some help, Arrow." "Und hear that true. State your business or get off my land." His smile widened. "Just being neighborly, wanted to make sure you understood the situation. This valley takes care of its own, see, and some folks are worried that you might be taking care of the wrong kind of people." He nodded toward Chen Wei. "Man like that, no telling what he might do. Steal your valuables, hurt you in your sleep. Maybe worse. People would understand if something happened to him, might even be grateful." "Nothing's going to happen to anyone." "That's so?" Cobb leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Well, I'll tell you what, some of the boys and me were collecting a little insurance. Just to keep the peace, you understand. $10 a month ought to cover it. You pay that and we'll make sure no trouble finds its way to your door. You don't pay it," he shrugged. "Well, trouble has a way of finding folks who don't cooperate." Sarah's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "I don't have $10 a month. I barely have $10 to my name." "That's a shame," Cobb said. "That's a real shame. Guess we'll have to find some other way for you to show your appreciation." His eyes moved past her to where Chen Wei stood motionless in the field. "Maybe we'll start with your pet Chinaman there. Take him off your hands. Do the community a service." "You leave him alone." Cobb laughed. It was an ugly sound full of contempt and certainty. "Tell you what, widow, I'm a reasonable man. You've got until the end of the week to find that money. After that, well," he tipped his hat, "we'll be seeing you." They rode away, and Sarah stood there until the dust of their passage had settled back to earth. Then she walked into the field where Chen Wei was waiting, his eyes tracking the departing riders, his body coiled with a tension she hadn't seen in him before. "You should send me away," he said quietly. "I bring you trouble." "Trouble found me before you did. At least now I have someone to face it with." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Then he nodded once and went back to work. The days that followed felt like the slow tightening of a noose. News traveled fast in a valley this small, and soon everyone knew that Sarah Meadows had defied Cobb, that she was harboring a Chinaman and refusing to pay protection. Some people shook their heads and said she'd always been stubborn. Others said she was a fool who'd get what was coming to her. A few, precious few, said nothing at all but looked at her with something that might have been respect. On the 4th night, she woke to the smell of smoke. Her haystack was burning, a pillar of flame lighting up the darkness, and she ran outside in her nightgown with her rifle in her hands, but there was nothing to shoot at. Just the fire and the darkness and the distant sound of hoofbeats fading into the hills. Chen Wei appeared beside her, a bucket of water in each hand, already fighting the blaze. They worked together through the night, saving what they could, which wasn't much. By dawn, the haystack was a smoldering ruin and they were both black with soot and exhausted. She found herself crying, not loud or dramatic, just silent tears cutting tracks through the ash on her face. It was too much. It was all too much. The drought and the hostility, and now this, and she was just one woman alone, trying to hold on to something that the whole world seemed determined to take away. Chen Wei stood beside her, watching the last wisps of smoke rise into the morning sky. Then he did something he'd never done before. He reached out and touched her shoulder just briefly, just enough to let her know he was there. "I was a soldier once," he said quietly. "In my country, before I came here, I was trained to fight, trained to kill." She looked at him, this thin, quiet man who'd been working her fields for months, and saw something different in his face. Something hard and old and dangerous. "The chains I carry," he continued, They are weapons from my training. I have not used them in many years. I promised myself I would never use them again." He paused, looking at the ruined haystack. "But some promises cannot be kept." Chen Wei. "Tomorrow they will come back, and when they do, they will learn that the Widow Meadows is not alone. They will learn that the Chinaman they mocked is not what they thought." His voice was calm, almost gentle. "They will learn fear." The next evening, Cobb came down from the hills with 4 of his men. They rode into the farmyard as the sun was setting, 5 silhouettes against the blood-red sky, and they were laughing among themselves about what they planned to do. The widow had been given her warning. Now it was time for consequences. Chen Wei met them in the middle of the yard. He stood there alone, unarmed as far as they could see, a thin figure in patched clothes and second-hand boots. Cobb dismounted slowly, still grinning, and his men spread O.T. in a loose circle around this man, who had the audacity to stand in their way. "Well, well," Cobb said, "the Chinaman thinks he's brave, that's cute." He looked around, making a show of searching for Sarah. "Where's your mistress, boy? Hiding inside, smart woman. Maybe she'll be smarter once we're done with you." "You should leave now," Chen Wei said softly. The men laughed, all 5 of them, laughing at this thin, ridiculous man who thought he could give them orders. "Did you hear that, boys?" Cobb chuckled. "He wants us to leave. Maybe we should ask nicely, maybe." He was reaching for his pistol as he spoke, still laughing, still so certain of his power and his position in this world. He never finished the motion. The chains moved like living things, silver blurs in the lantern light, and every man in that dusty yard felt his blood turn to winter. The first chain wrapped around Cobb's wrist and snapped tight with a sound like a whip crack, and the pistol went spinning into the dirt along with a spray of blood. Cobb screamed, but Chen Wei was already moving, spinning, the second chain lashing out to catch another man around the ankles and yank him off his feet. The weighted darts at the ends of the chains whistled through the air like angry hornets, striking with precision, targeting wrists and hands and knees, disarming and disabling with surgical accuracy. It was over in less than a minute. 5 men lay groaning in the dirt, not one of them dead, but all of them broken in some essential way. Chen Wei stood in the center of the yard, those twin serpents of steel coiled and ready at his sides, his breath barely quickened by the exertion. His face was calm, almost peaceful, the face of a man who had finally stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. Sarah stepped off the porch, her rifle still in her hands, though she hadn't needed it. She looked at the fallen men, then at Chen Wei, then back at the men again. "You should have listened," she said quietly. "He told you to leave." Cobb looked up from where he lay cradling his shattered wrist, his face gray with pain and terror. "What are you?" he whispered. "What the hell are you?" Chen Wei knelt beside him, bringing their faces close together. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost kind. "I'm a man who was shown mercy when he deserved none. I'm a man who was given food when he was starving and shelter when he was dying. I'm a man who learned from a woman with more courage than all of you together that kindness is not weakness." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm also a man who spent 20 years learning how to kill with these chains. I could have killed all of you tonight. I chose not to. Do not make me choose differently." He stood up and stepped back, the chains retracting to wrap loosely around his waist once more. "Go back to your hills," Sarah said. "Go and don't come back. Tell everyone what happened here. Tell them the Widow Meadows is under my protection now." She looked at Chen Wei and something passed between them, some understanding that didn't need words. "Tell them we protect each other." Cobb and his men stumbled and crawled their way back to their horses. It took them longer than it should have, with broken bones and bleeding wounds, but eventually they managed to mount up and ride away into the darkness. None of them looked back. Sarah and Chen Wei stood together in the empty yard, listening to the sound of hoofbeats fading into the hills. The night was quiet now, peaceful, like the valley was holding its breath. "You could have killed them," she said finally. "Why didn't you?" Chen Wei was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his shirt and pulled out something small, something he'd kept hidden close to his heart. It was a photograph, old and creased, showing a woman and two small children. "My family," he said. "In China. I left them to find work here to send money home. That was 15 years ago. The railroad paid me almost nothing. The mines paid less. I have not seen them since." He looked at the photograph and his face was filled with an ancient sorrow. "I became a soldier before I became a father. I know how to kill. I know how to hurt. But my wife, she taught me something different. She taught me that strength means choosing not to hurt, even when you could." He looked at Sarah, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw tears in his eyes. "You remind me of her," he said softly. "Strong and kind and stubborn, she would have liked you." Sarah didn't know what to say, so she did what felt right. She reached out and took his hand just for a moment, just long enough to let him know that he wasn't alone. "You should find them," she said. "Your family, when this is over, you should go home." "I thought about it," he admitted, "many times, but I have no money for passage, and I do not know if they still live. It has been so long." He smiled, but it was a sad smile heavy with years of loss. "Maybe. It is better not to know. Maybe it is better to keep the hope." They stood together in the darkness, two broken people who had somehow found each other across all the miles and years and differences that should have kept them apart. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, and the wind whispered through the valley like a prayer. The weeks that followed were quieter than any Sarah could remember. Cobb and his men had disappeared into the hills and not been seen since. The farmers who had shunned her began to nod again, cautiously, when they passed on the road. Even Reverend Holloway had softened his sermons, replacing warnings about foreign influence with vague talk about the mysterious ways of providence. Chen Wei continued to work the farm, but something had changed between them. They talked more now, shared meals together, laughed at small jokes that only the two of them would understand. He taught her a few words of Chinese. She taught him how to make biscuits the way her mother had. They were still master and worker on the surface, but beneath that they had become something else. Partners, friends, family. One evening, as the summer finally began to break and the first hints of autumn crept into the air, a stranger rode up to the farmhouse. He was Chinese, young and well-dressed, and he carried a leather satchel over his shoulder. He asked for Chen Wei by name. Sarah watched from the porch as the two men spoke in rapid Chinese, their voices rising and falling with emotion she couldn't follow. She saw Chen Wei's face go pale, then red, then pale again. She saw him take something from the young man's hands and stare at it like he was seeing a ghost. When the young man left, Chen Wei came to her with tears streaming down his face. In his hands were letters, a thick stack of them, written in Chinese characters she couldn't read. "My daughter," he whispered. "She has been looking for me for years. She grew up. She learned English. She works for a shipping company in San Francisco now." He laughed, a broken sound, half joy and half grief. "She hired people to find me. It took them a long time, but they found me." "Your daughter," Sarah repeated. "She's alive." "She is alive, and she is coming here." He looked at the letters in his hands, at the years of love and longing that they contained, and he wept like a child. "She is coming to take me home." 3 weeks later, a young woman arrived at the farm. She was beautiful and fierce and determined, and when she saw her father standing in the doorway of the barn, she ran to him and threw her arms around him and didn't let go for a very long time. Sarah watched from a distance, giving them their privacy, feeling something in her chest that was part joy and part sorrow and part something she couldn't name. That night, Chen Wei's daughter, whose name was Mei Lin, sat with Sarah on the porch and told her everything. How she had saved every penny to come to America. How she had worked her way up from nothing to become a translator for the shipping company. How she had never stopped believing that her father was still alive somewhere, still waiting to be found. "He wrote about you in his letters," Malin said, looking at Sarah with curious eyes. "He said you saved his life. He said you were the first person in this country who saw him as a man instead of a Chinaman." He saved mine too, Sarah said quietly, more than once. I know, he told me about the men with guns, about what he did. Malin paused, choosing her words carefully. He told me he had promised himself never to use those skills again, but he broke that promise for you. He didn't have to. I never asked him to. That is why it matters. Malin reached out and took Sarah's hand, the same gesture Chen Wei had made on the night of the fire. In my culture, we believe that some debts cannot be repaid. They can only be honored. My father will honor his debt to you for the rest of his life, she smiled. And so will I. Chen Wei left with his daughter 3 days later. Sarah stood at the gate and watched them ride away, their figures growing smaller and smaller against the morning horizon, until finally they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the distance and the light. She thought she would feel empty after he was gone. Instead, she felt full. Full of memories and gratitude and the knowledge that she had done something right in this world, that she had chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier, and that choice had rippled outward in ways she could never have predicted. 2 years later, she received a letter from San Francisco. Chen Wei had returned to China with his daughter. He had found his wife still living in the same village where they had been married, older now but still strong, still waiting after all those years. He had used the money Malin had saved to buy back the family farm that had been sold to pay debts. He was home. Enclosed with the letter was a small package. Inside she found a length of silver chain, one of the steel serpents that had saved her life on that terrible night. A note, written in careful English, explained that Chen Wei wanted her to have it, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Strength is choosing not to hurt when you could, the note read. But sometimes, for the people we love, we must choose to fight. Thank you for being someone worth fighting for. Sarah hung the chain above her fireplace, where it caught the light on winter evenings and reminded her of a thin, quiet man who had stumbled into her barn half dead and changed her life forever. The valley softened over the years that followed. The drought broke. The farmers prospered. New people came, some Chinese among them, and if there was suspicion at first, it faded with time and familiarity. Sarah became known as someone who would help anyone who needed it, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. Her farm became a way station of sorts, a place where travelers could find a meal and a bed and no questions asked. She never married again. She never felt the need. She had learned that family wasn't just blood, that connection could form between the most unlikely people in the most unlikely circumstances, and that love, real love, didn't require romance or possession. It just required seeing someone else clearly and choosing to stand beside them anyway. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would take down the chain from above the fireplace and hold it in her hands, feeling the weight of it, remembering the man who had wielded it with such terrible grace. She would think about all the people who had laughed at him, all the people who had seen only a thin foreign stranger in patched clothes and assumed he was nothing. She would think about how they had frozen when his steel serpents flashed, when the truth of him finally emerged from behind the mask he wore to survive. And she would smile, because she had known the truth all along. She had seen him clearly from the very first moment, when he lay dying in her barnyard and asked for water with eyes that expected nothing. She had known that beneath the rags and the hunger and the years of suffering, there was a man of extraordinary strength and honor, a man who had chosen gentleness despite everything the world had done to him. That was the real lesson, she thought. Not that violence could save you, though sometimes it could. Not that kindness could change hearts, though sometimes it did. The real lesson was simpler and harder than that. The real lesson was that people were always more than they appeared. Always deeper, always more complicated, always carrying histories and hopes and fears that you couldn't see from the outside. The real lesson was that judgment was easy and understanding was hard, but understanding was the only thing that could break the cycle of cruelty and fear. The real lesson was that Chen Wei, the man they had mocked and dismissed, the man they had called a thief and an opium eater and worse, had been the most honorable person in the entire valley. And she, a widow with nothing but stubbornness and a dying farm, had been the only one wise enough to see it. Years later, when she was old and gray and ready to leave this world behind, Sarah would tell this story to the children who gathered on her porch. She would tell them about the thin man in rags who appeared in her barnyard, about the chains he wore hidden beneath his shirt, about the night when steel serpents flashed with devil's fury and saved her life. She would tell them about Mei Lin and the letters and the journey home that took 15 years but finally ended in reunion. And always at the end, she would say the same thing. Don't judge people by what they look like or where they come from. Don't assume you know someone's story just because you've seen a single chapter. Everyone is carrying something heavy. Everyone is fighting a battle you can't see. The kindest thing you can do, the bravest thing, is to reach out your hand anyway. The children would nod solemnly, not fully understanding but remembering anyway, carrying those words with them into their own futures, into a world that was still learning, slowly and painfully, how to be better. And high above the fireplace, the steel serpent caught the evening light and gleamed like a promise, like a memory, like a reminder that the man they had laughed at had been, all along, the most dangerous and the most gentle soul any of them would ever know.